Members of the jury, we end right where we began. It was an accidental discharge. I was trying to take the magazine out and it went off. They was both in bed. I was in their room. Those were the statements of the defendant, Jermaine Bass Jr. Mere minutes after he murdered his daughter while she was laying in the top bunk of her bed. Those were his statements as he was holding his son, who was profusely bleeding from a gunshot wound to the side of his head that he caused. It was an accident. I was loading the magazine. I was in their room. Those statements you heard on the body-worn camera of Adam Lawman, HCSO deputy who first responded. I want to draw your attention on that same body-worn camera to the timestamp of 22:46:20. Right after he made these statements, the defendant was asked, what happened upstairs? He looked straight at the deputies and he said, nothing happened upstairs. That man uttered those words, nothing happened upstairs, when he knew that his daughter was on that top bunk with a gunshot wound to the middle of her forehead, and she was bleeding out and she was about to die. He said nothing happened upstairs. He didn't beg them to go save her. He didn't beg them to help her. He said nothing happened upstairs. We end right where we began. Right where we began. Where defense counsel in their opening statement to you said, my client did not shoot Jaylah Bass or JJ. We know that's not true. We know he did it. We know that forensic evidence points to him. And I want you to recall when our blood spatter expert was on the stand. She said to you, the scene will guide you to collect the evidence that is relevant so that you can piece together what happened. And members of the jury, that's exactly what happened throughout the duration of this trial. The testimony and evidence are pieces that, when laid together, form an arrow that point to the guilt of only one person in this case. The defendant murdered his 5-year-old daughter as she was sleeping, and he tried to murder his 8-year-old son, JJ. Remember this last Friday during jury selection, you were taught that the state has the burden to prove the elements of the crimes charged beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge explained that to you, and in fact, she just read it in this packet. It helps to know what the elements are, what we're focusing on as we go through discussing how and why we know the defendant is guilty of each element of each crime charged in this case. We'll go one by one. First degree premeditated murder. To prove the crime of first degree premeditated murder, the state must prove the following 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Jaylah Bass is dead. Number 2, the death was caused by the criminal act of Jermaine LaVonda Bass. And number 3, there was a premeditated killing of Jaylah Bass. He's also charged with 2 counts of aggravated child abuse. There we talk about number 1, Jermaine LaVonda Bass committed aggravated battery upon Jaylah Bass or Jermaine Bass. That's counts 2 and 3. Jaylah Bass or Jermaine Bass were under the age of 18. We know that. Jermaine LaVonda Bass actually and intentionally caused bodily harm to Jaylah Bass or Jermaine Bass, counts 2 and 3. In doing so, Jermaine LaVonda Bass intentionally or knowingly caused great bodily harm. We know that as well. You saw the gunshot wounds. The last count he's charged with is count 4, premeditated murder. Jermaine LaVonda Bass intended to commit the crime of first-degree premeditated murder. Number 2, Jermaine LaVonda Bass committed an overt act toward the commission of first-degree premeditated murder that went beyond mere preparation. Number 3, Jermaine LaVonda Bass failed to complete the first-degree premeditated murder. Let's talk about how and why we know the defendant is the one who pulled the trigger. And let's talk about how and why we know that he did it intentionally. We know that the defendant started out his night by leaving his 5-year-old and his 7-year-old home alone in their beds. We know that's true. 5 and 7, home alone at nighttime. We know that he followed his wife Shirley to her family dinner in the West Shore area at Ruth's Chris restaurant. How do we know that? States Exhibit 21. We can track his cell phone records. He leaves the children home alone by at least 7:15 p.m. We know that's true because of the video surveillance shows him leaving before that time. We know that Shirley got to dinner and that the defendant arrived in the West Shore area where Ruth's Chris is located. And around 10 o'clock, we know that he's calling Shirley and he's leaving by 10:01. We heard testimony from Shirley's niece, who's kind of more like a cousin, they're similar in age, China Gadsden. She explained to you what she saw that night. She saw the defendant in his Nissan truck pull in front of Shirley's car that she was driving, stop, get out, walk up to the vehicle, and confront Shirley for going to a family dinner. You know, he immediately got back in his car and went to his house. That's what States 21 shows through his phone records. We know that's true. Just like Anna Cuffs said, the evidence will reveal to you what happened. Other evidence that reveals this, in fact, is true, that the defendant followed Shirley to her dinner and confronted her, is the IM crime camera video footage that we see of the defendant's car. We can read between the lines of the evidence we have as to the way the defendant was feeling at the time he arrived back home and went inside where 5-year-old Jaylah Bass Bass JJ was laying right next to her. Now again, the scene will reveal itself. We only have to follow it. We know that the children were in the bed together. Laying side by side. In the bed. I'm putting up State's 24.
The state's closing argument, starting with some of the defendant's statements that it was an accidental discharge. He was trying to take out the magazine and it discharged. Do you believe that version or not? Remember, the defendant did not testify and they didn't put on a defense. We're going to hit the pause button. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll get you back in for more of the closing arguments.
Two innocent children put to bed only to be awakened by the sound of gunfire.
Now a jury must decide the fate of this father. Tonight on Closing Arguments, a bitter custody battle, a murder-for-hire plot, and the victim's former in-laws at the center of it all. We're unpacking today's hearing in the case against Donna Adelson.
Closing Arguments, tonight at 8/7 Central, only on Court TV.
Now to Florida for the Bedtime murder trial. Jermaine Bass is accused of fatally shooting his 5-year-old daughter and attempting to murder his 8-year-old son back in August of 2022. Prosecutors say that Jermaine's wife, Shirley, returned home from a dinner that night. She went to say goodnight to their 2 children, and then just moments after going back downstairs, she heard multiple gunshots. Police arrived to find Jermaine on the couch holding his son, who survived his injuries. The couple's 5-year-old daughter was found deceased upstairs in her bed where she had been playing in her bunk. Well, let's get you back into that courtroom now for more of the state's closing argument.
Because the forensic evidence tells us so. We know that Jaylah Bass was closest to the wall, her head where this pooling of blood is seen, right next to her, either touching a mattress or slightly above. At the point in time that the firearm was pointed at their heads and the trigger was pulled. Remember last Friday when we discussed premeditation, Mr. Terry was talking to you about there's no specific time frame when you're trying to decide whether or not an act was premeditated. It can happen in an instant. Recall that today, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office firearm expert Jennifer Michaelon took the stand and explained to you what would have to take place in order for that Glock 42 to fire. She explained you first have to take the magazine, you have to load it with bullets. You have to put that filled magazine inside the bottom well of the firearm. You then have to slide the top of the firearm back in order for it to fire. Then, like she explained, when she's firing these firearms regularly during the course of her investigations as a firearm expert, she uses 2 hands to be able to safely and precisely point and aim within a 6-inch area. Loading the magazine with bullets, putting the magazine inside of the firearm, sliding the top back to make it ready. And then she further explained, not only do you have to point it and aim it, each time you pull the trigger, you have to pull it hard enough to first compress the trigger pull, safety, and then the trigger itself. And she explained to you that because it is not an automatic firearm, that each time you pull the trigger, you have to pull it and let it go, and pull it, 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 and let it go. And members of the jury, that evidence is the scene itself, the evidence revealing to you what premeditation is. All of those steps is the scene revealing to you through evidence what premeditation is. Look at the bullet holes. On these precious children's face. Look at them.
Objection, Your Honor, improper argument. I
Look.
ask the jury be disregarded.
All right, the jury's to disregard the last statement by the prosecutor. Speak facts. Let's talk about the facts.
Look where the bullet holes are located on Jaylah Bass's head. Those are aimed, precise, deliberate bullet holes. That is not an accident. That is not loading the firearm and it going off. Those are aimed, precise, deliberate shots. Shots that require some sort of control over the firearm. Shot through her cheek, her temple, and her forehead. Jennifer Michaelon says that shots that are within 6 inches of one another require her to use 2 hands to shoot. This is the shot. Now, recall he's laying right next to his sister in the bed, the top bunk. We don't know what order they were shot, but consider the proximity when deciding how deliberate these shots are. Consider the proximity when deciding how precise they are. That is the evidence revealing to you premeditation, intent, and deliberate shots. Shots that are aimed at the most crucial part of a human being's body. Recall, the scene will reveal to you the evidence necessary for you to come to a conclusion as to what happened. We know from the defendant's wallet that was seized, states 15. Recall that this wallet was taken directly found in a closed drawer within a wallet that was right next to the firearm used to murder JJ, an attempt to murder JJ, and right next to the ammunition found. Note on this, height, Jermaine Lavonda Bass Jr., 5'7". Why is that important? Let's consider the trajectory of the fire's shot that killed Jaylah Bass and almost killed JJ. We know that the children were laying next to
Marie
each
and
other.
Philip are staying with us for more analysis next hour. Coming up, we're going to bring you more of the closing arguments and the bedtime murder trial for Jermaine Bass. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Court TV Live. To Court TV Live, I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are tracking several major trials this afternoon here at Court TV. In Florida, closing arguments are underway for a father accused of killing his young daughter and trying to kill his son. And in California, the state's case continues in the celebrity stylist murder trial for Monica Simontilli. Also in California, we are in a verdict watch in the drunken judge murder trial for a former judge accused of shooting his wife. Of course, we'll continue to keep you updated on all of these trials throughout the day. But for now, let's head back to Florida for the bedtime murder trial for Jermaine Bass. We're going to take you back in where we left off for more of the state's closing argument.
To each other, we know that the blood shown in the pulling of this photo of the top mattress belongs to Jaylah Bass because it's red. Consider the trajectory of the bullets you see. Knowing the bunk bed is topmost portion of the bunk bed is 5 feet 5 inches tall. The defendant is taller than that. We know that damage A is at a downward trajectory, meaning that when the gun was fired, it has to be angled upward, downward to cause that downward trajectory. We know that this shot goes all the way through to the bathroom in a downward trajectory because we saw evidence of that. The scene will reveal the evidence necessary for you to decipher what happened. Whoever was holding the firearm had to have been taller than 5 feet 5 inches tall. We know that there was no stippling found on the wounds of Jaylah Bass, meaning that whoever fired the weapon pointing right at her had to be at least, from the testimony, at least 2 to 3 feet away from her. If you follow the trajectory of the bullet holes that you see here, take them out 2 to 3 feet, that puts you off the bed. At a height consistent with the defendant holding his hands above the rail and pointing it downward. We know also that the person standing on the outside of this bunk bed, at least 2 to 3 feet away from where the children were laying. We know the trajectory as well because of the impact blood stain pattern. Now, Anna Cox, when she testified, was very educational when she was describing to you what blood stain pattern analysis is. She explained that it's a discipline of forensic science focusing on identifying, documenting, and analyzing blood stains in order to interpret what caused the distribution. Basically, in layman's terms, she says she looks at the blood stain and tries to decide how it got there. She went on to explain to us different kinds of blood stains and what they mean and how she interprets them. One of them was an impact blood stain, or an impact spattered pattern, which she said a natural object striking the liquid blood. She said she considered things such as physics, the natural laws of gravity, and introduction of a mechanism such as force. So if something were to hit an object bleeding, it would cause a certain pattern, blood pattern stain. Directionality, flow pattern. She said in her expert opinion, based on the DNA evidence that was swabbed from this area, it showed that both JJ and Jaylah's heads were in this corner of the bed at the time in which they were shot. That's an important piece of evidence because, remember, we end where it began. When defense mentioned in their opening statement to you that their client didn't pull the trigger. Well, members of the jury, it's one thing to make a statement like that and then move on. But it requires you to pull the thread, to follow the analysis, to let the scene reveal to you what happened. And you have to follow it until the end. The end is the DNA on the firearm. Now, recall this series of events. The children are shot. They're on the top bunk. When law enforcement arrives, the defendant is holding his son, who's profusely bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head. When he's asked, "Where's the firearm?" he explains to the deputies that it's on top of the dresser, and later explains that it's in the drawer in the master bedroom of the dresser. So let's keep pulling the thread, because what does that mean? It means that after he murdered his daughter Jaylah, and after he shot his son in the temple, that he left them there, walked all the way past 2 bathrooms into the master bedroom, and he opened up that silver drawer. He put the gun and the magazine inside, and he closed that dresser drawer before doing anything else. That's significant. The gun was in a closed dresser drawer. If an accident happened in the room with his children, would not a reasonable parent render aid immediately?
Objection, Your Honor. Improper argument.
Overruled.
It's not reasonable to believe that it was an accident. It's not reasonable to believe that after this firearm accidentally discharged 5 times, that someone would then walk past 2 bedrooms into a different room, open a drawer, place the firearm inside of that drawer, and close it before doing anything else. It is not reasonable to believe. We also know the defendant didn't call 911.
Objection. Improper argument, Your Honor.
So sustained.
The phone records show that at 10:34, the defendant dialed out to a number belonging to his mother. Cox was right. The scene reveals the evidence necessary for you to come to a conclusion as to what happened. The defendant loaded his firearm with a magazine. He slid it back to load it. He then stood on the outside of that gray bunk bed, put his arm up and over the railing, and fired at his children as they lay sleeping in the top bunk of the bed. The evidence reveals that he shot his daughter Jaylah 3 times and she died. The evidence reveals that he shot his son JJ in the temple, causing severe injuries that he still suffers from. The DNA puts the firearm in his hands. The trajectory puts the firearm in his hands. And members of the jury, the evidence, when put together, forms an arrow pointing at the guilt of only one person in this case. The defendant, Jermaine Bass, murdered his daughter, Jaylah Bass, who was 5 years old. And he did it with intention, he did it with precision, and he did it with premeditation. The defendant tried to kill his son, JJ. And he did it with intention, he did it with precision, and he did it with premeditation. And the law and the evidence demand that you find him guilty.